Welcome to your favorite channel for mystery and horror lovers. In this dark world of mysterious crimes and human monsters, some stories make us question the nature of evil. Is a killer born a murderer, or do circumstances create him? Today's case is about a man who appeared to everyone as a handsome, polite, and promising young student. But behind that facade lurked a ruthless monster. This is the story of Theo Durrant, the medical student who turned a church into a crime scene, becoming one of the most brutal killers in San Francisco's history. What drove him to commit such atrocities? Was he truly innocent, as he claimed until his final moments? Or was he a manipulative killer who deceived everyone? Get ready for a thrilling journey through gruesome crimes, shocking investigations, and a trial that ended in a tragic fate. But before we begin, don't forget to support the channel by subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you never miss a new dive into the darkness. Now, let's begin our story. The macabre scene in the little room off to the side of the death house at San Quentin was a fitting end to a gory and violent series of crimes. Even the actions of Theo Durrant's parents shed little light on what had caused the handsome, polite medical student to turn into a monster and violently murder two young women with whom he attended church. As the recently hanged body of William Henry Theodore Durrant lay in repose in the state-issued coffin not 4 feet from their table, his parents sat down to a sumptuous meal of roast beef, fruit salad, and tea, enjoying the repast as if they hadn't a care in the world. Perhaps they took solace in their son's strenuous assertion that he was innocent of the heinous murders of two young women with whom he attended church, Minnie Williams and Blanche Lamont. Their naked, ravaged bodies were found tossed aside like so much soiled linen. If the parents believed that their son was innocent, then they were the only ones in San Francisco who did, for as the date of his execution neared, Durrant converted to Catholicism when his Baptist minister admitted he had trouble believing Durrant's claim of unjust prosecution. The jurors who convicted medical student Theo Durrant certainly had no trouble with the state's case. They took just 5 minutes to return with a guilty verdict. Maybe the question of why Theo turned into a sexual sadist was too perplexing for the Durrants, and they simply chose to ignore it. No one ever asked them. Theo Durrant went to meet his maker without admitting guilt, and nothing in his many statements to the press during his incarceration and on the day of his execution shed any light on the one question that no scientist or philosopher seems able to answer. From where do such monsters come? Blanche Lamont, 18, was the epitome of late 19th century femininity and sexuality. She was probably very pleased when the handsome 24-year-old Theo Durrant started courting her. Durrant, the assistant superintendent of the Sunday school at Emanuel Baptist Church in San Francisco, was certainly a catch. Everyone thought he was quite handsome, gallant, and gentlemanly. He was courteous to ladies young and old, and as a medical student at nearby Cooper Medical College, his future appeared bright. For her part, Blanche was also a prize. A photograph of her shows a dark-eyed beauty with creamy skin, tightly coiffed raven hair, and a slender neck. Contemporary reports took note of Blanche's long, doe-like eyelashes. Born in Montana, but living with her aunt and uncle near the church on 21st St., Blanche was young, but she was not naive. Elizabeth McConnell reports in Sympathy for the Devil that Blanche knew she was attractive, and she took care to keep herself that way. Blanche dressed well and was studying to be a teacher at the normal school just up the road from Cooper Medical College. So it's hardly surprising that Theo and Blanche met up with each other at the electric trolley stop near their homes as they traveled to their respective schools on a crisp April morning in 1895. Trial testimony reported in the newspapers of the day attests that each of them was well noticed by the other riders on the tram that morning. Blanche wore a billowing black skirt topped with a fashionable Basque jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that tied beneath her chin with a bright yellow ribbon. She stared ahead with a knowing smile as Theo whispered in her ear and playfully slapped at her with the kid gloves she had removed upon boarding the tram. Very likely, Durrant was making arrangements to meet Blanche later that afternoon at the Emanuel Church, but neither of them had religion on their minds. It had become fashionable for young people to meet for clandestine sexual rendezvous in empty church rooms, and Emanuel Baptist had apparently seen its share of such blasphemies. Recently, one of the church elders had mentioned this to fellow leaders, bemoaning, "I have heard stories of strange actions on the part of some of the young people of the church," Harold Schechter writes. Durrant and Lamont parted at the Polk St. stop and bade farewell as they went to their respective schools. Each spent a presumably nondescript day in their studies, and before 2 o'clock that afternoon, Durrant was pacing anxiously near the Polk St. trolley stop. Witnesses said he nearly flew down the street as he saw young Blanche Lamont walking up the hill from the normal school. They boarded the tram together, joined by May Lanigan, who later testified that she remembered the meeting vividly because it was the man's hair which attracted my attention, as it struck me as unusual to see a gentleman with such long hair, McConnell reported. Another witness would be able to place the two walking purposefully toward Emanuel Church a short time later. This time, the woman's Victorian sensibilities were disturbed by the way the wind pressed Blanche's dress tightly to her full-bodied form. A third witness, Mrs. Caroline Leake, saw Durrant open the heavy oak door in the center of the three Gothic arches that adorned the church and hold it as Blanche entered. Mrs. Leake was the last person other than Durrant to see Blanche Lamont alive. The wind blew the solid door shut, sealing in any noise from the sanctuary. Schechter writes that the newspapers that covered the murder of Blanche Lamont state that the young lady, worldly yet demure, did not part with life and honor without a struggle, and that a sexual outrage had probably occurred after death. None of that was known to church choral director George King as he entered the sanctuary about 3 hours later. King was in the sanctuary to practice organ sonatas, and he had barely seated himself at the instrument before a very pale and somewhat disorganized Durrant appeared. "I've been fixing a gas jet upstairs," Durrant explained. "Be a good fellow and go to the drugstore and fetch a bromo seltzer." King complied, and within moments of his return with the tonic, color had returned to Durrant's face and his features took on their normal, handsome appearance. Durrant said goodbye and strode out into the cool evening air. King practiced his Bach, not knowing that the naked corpse of Blanche Dumont lay hidden high above him. Durrant had propped Blanche's head between 2 blocks of wood, just as medical students were taught to do to cadavers they were examining. Durrant had also folded Blanche's arms across her naked breasts, as if in preparation for burial. He left the bell tower through a seldom-used trapdoor, leaving his grisly work to the dust and flies. Durrant returned that same night to the Emanuel Baptist Church for the evening prayer service. There he spotted Mrs. Tryphena Noble, Blanche Lamont's aunt. He inquired about the student teacher. Tryphena looked worried as she told Theo that she had hoped Blanche would be at the prayer service because the girl had not returned home from school that day, and her absence was most disturbing. Schechter reports that Durrant had brought a book he wanted Blanche to read. "I regret she is not with us," Durrant replied sympathetically. "I have a copy of The Newcomes by Thackeray for her. I will drop it off at the house." For some unknown reason, Tryphena Noble waited 3 days before she reported Blanche's disappearance to the police. Immediately, suspicion fell on Theo Durrant, who upon closer examination seemed to be preoccupied with sex. Schechter and McConnell agree that Durrant had confided in a fellow student that he had no knowledge of women. Another account of the crime, in Crimes and Punishment, recounts how police learned that another young lady of Emanuel Baptist Church had once been accosted in the library of the church by Durrant in, as she delicately put it, his birthday suit. In contradiction to the claim that Durrant was a virgin, Crimes and Punishment claims Theo bragged of his exploits in the brothels of Carson City and once boasted that he had raped an Indian woman, although McConnell, who wrote the most in-depth study of the crime, makes no mention of this. Regardless, Durrant did little to allay suspicions of his involvement in Blanche's disappearance. "Perhaps," he told police, "she has wandered from the moral path and gone astray." Later, he appeared at Tryphena Noble's home with his copy of Thackeray for Blanche and spoke of his fear that her niece had been kidnapped and would be forced into a life of prostitution. He vowed to rescue her from this horrid fate. Down in the city's Tenderloin district, Durrant attempted to pawn some women's rings, but was unable to strike a deal with a pawnbroker. Shortly afterward, Mrs. Noble received 3 rings belonging to Blanche in the mail. They were wrapped in a paper bearing the name George King. She would later testify in court. But without a body and no sign of foul play, the police could only file away the disappearance of Blanche Lamont and hope that either the young woman would turn up alive or that more clues to her fate would reveal themselves. In the meantime, Theo Durrant began paying attention to another church-going young lady, Minnie Williams, 21. It was on Good Friday, April 12, 1895, that Minnie bade farewell to her boarding house companions and headed off to a Christian fellowship meeting at the home of an Emanuel Baptist Church elder. That was at 7 p.m. A few moments later, Minnie was observed speaking sharply with Theo Durrant in front of the church. Their conversation was so heated that a man named Hodgkins, who was on his way home down Bartlett Saint, stopped to intervene. His manner was unbecoming to a gentleman, Hodgkins recalled later, according to Schechter. The peace restored, Minnie and Theo entered the church together, and Hodgkins went on his way. 2 hours later, Durrant arrived at the home of Mrs. Mary Vogel, whose husband was in charge of the Christian fellowship meeting. Mrs. Vogel was one of the witnesses who saw Theo and Blanche Lamont go into the church 9 days before. Testimony at his trial revealed that Durrant appeared shaken and disheveled at the Vogel house, and that before joining his friends in the meeting, announced that he had to wash his hands. He did so, and by the time the meeting broke up at close to midnight, he appeared to be no longer upset. The only odd thing anyone noticed was that upon leaving the Vogel home, Durrant mentioned that he had to return to the church because he had left something. As he was a member of the California Signal Corps, the precursor to the National Guard, Durrant left San Francisco on Saturday, April 13th, and headed to a bivouac on Mount Diablo. In preparation for the Easter Sunday service, several of the ladies of Emanuel Baptist gathered in the church on Saturday to decorate the pews with flowers. The work wasn't difficult, and it didn't take long for the Ladies' Society to finish. With a few moments to spare, the group decided to take a bit of refreshment in a room off the church vestibule, which was used as a library. No one was paying much attention when one of the women opened a cupboard door in search of teacups. With a horrible shriek, the woman took a step back and promptly fainted. The others in the room turned to look. What they saw sent the lot of them screaming into the street. Their agonies prompted calls to the police, who were directed into the library, where they found the naked, brutalized body of Minnie Williams. Minnie had been crammed into the cupboard. Her wrists had been slashed, her breasts stabbed repeatedly, and her underclothes had been forced down her throat. Blood had seeped out of the cupboard onto the library floor. A description by the San Francisco Examiner that Schechter included in his book conveys the brutality of the slaying. She had been gagged, and that in a manner indicative of a fiend rather than a man, the paper reported. A portion of her underclothing had been thrust down her throat with a stick, her tongue being terribly lacerated by the operation. The cuts on Minnie's arms were so deep that not only had the monster cut her arteries, but the tendons had been severed as well. The stab wounds to her breasts were made with a dull table knife, one of those used in the church at entertainments where refreshments are served. Schechter wrote, "There was some difference of opinion as to whether Minnie had been stripped by the killer as a prelude to sex or to facilitate the fatal stab wounds. It appeared that the cold-blooded wretch had deliberately unfastened his victim's dress that the knife might penetrate her flesh," the Examiner reported, while the San Francisco Call hinted that Minnie had been a cooperative partner to intercourse before her death. Eventually, the coroner ruled that Minnie had been raped after death. Police had but one suspect, Theo Durrant, and the San Francisco Chronicle led its Easter Sunday edition with a proclamation that not only had Durrant killed Minnie Williams, but that he had probably slaughtered Blanche Lamont as well. The paper goaded the police into searching the church for clues to Blanche's disappearance. The authorities made a perfunctory search of the church grounds Easter Sunday morning, not expecting to find much. After all, this was a church, and Lamont had been missing for nearly 2 weeks. It would be pretty hard to hide a body in a church for that long, especially the 2 weeks before Easter. Then someone remembered the belfry. The church tower was largely ornamental, as there was no bell there, and no one had reason to go up into the cupola. A close examination of the belfry trap door showed that it had recently been opened, and there were signs that whoever had done so had forced the hinges against the rust. Reopening the door, investigators were met by the smell of death and the buzzing of flies. A policeman hoisted a lantern up into the steeple and peered in. The bloated, decaying corpse of Blanche Lamont greeted the police. She lay naked and dead. Her face was fearfully distorted, the mouth being open, exposing the pearly teeth and attesting the terrible death the poor girl had died. Schechter quotes a paper as reporting. Word of the horrific discovery spread fast, and soon a crowd had gathered outside the church. Thousands crowded around the church, while the streets in front of the newspaper offices were packed with masses of humanity, all struggling to get a view of the bulletin boards, Schechter wrote. Immediately, the search began for Theo Durrant, the suspect the newspapers and the angry throng decided had committed the murder. Telegraphs were dispatched to every sheriff's office in the vicinity of Mount Diablo, Schechter writes. By the end of the day, a detective from the San Francisco Police Department had reached the Signal Corps camp and apprehended Theo Durrant. Schechter reports that the gruesome discovery provoked rage on the part of the people of San Francisco. An angry throng was down at Fisherman's Wharf to meet the ferry-carrying Date, Anthony, and his suspect, Durrant. Only the presence of a large police contingent prevented a lynching, he writes. Theo Durrant's trial began in the fall of 1895 and was front-page news in every big city newspaper in the nation. The mustachioed medical student yielded excellent copy for the penny papers, which reported daily on the exploits in the San Francisco courtroom. Like so many other brutal killers, Durrant drew his share of admirers and was besieged by marriage proposals and love letters. He was gentlemanly and gallant to his female admirers. Every morning during the 3-week trial, Durrant accepted a bouquet of flowers from a pretty blonde woman. The press dubbed her the sweet pea girl of San Francisco. While the prosecutors believed they had an open and shut case, the defense tried to shift suspicion from Durrant to the Emanuel Church pastor, the Reverend John George Gibson, who spent hours alone in the church and had access to all parts of the building. They pointed out that no blood was ever found on Durrant or any of his clothing, and that there was no indication the young man had destroyed any clothes. Prosecutors proposed that Durrant was naked during the murder of Minnie Williams, lending credence to the belief that Williams had been a willing sexual partner prior to her slaying. Durrant's soundness of mind was probed by doctors working for the prosecution, as well as for the defense. It was not claimed that Durrant was insane, wrote Matthew Worth Pinkerton in his contemporary account of the case, Murder in All Ages, 1898. Yet that there was something morally defective in his makeup is apparent. The psychologist who examined Durrant labeled him a moral idiot, but could not speculate on what caused Durrant's sudden murderous outbreak. The only clues had to be wrenched from Durrant himself, who, in between claims of innocence, announced that he was suffering from nightmares and hallucinations. Durrant put these down to stress from his unjust prosecution, but modern neuropsychological theories have more plausible explanations. There are several competing schools of thought as to what creates a monster like Theo Durrant. Pinkerton's statement that the criminal is one who flings aside conscience represents the view that criminal behavior, including violent crime, is a chosen lifestyle. This theory, developed by Dr. Samuel Yochelson and further refined by his protege, Dr. Stanton Samanow, believes that criminals choose to commit crimes. Crime resides within the person and is caused by the way he thinks, not by his environment, writes Samanow. Criminals think differently from responsible people. Samanow's theories argue that focusing on forces outside the criminal, environment, society, poverty, is futile and will do nothing to reduce criminal activity. The change must come from within. Another school takes a more neuropsychological view of the causes of crime. Dr. Jonathan Pincus, a Georgetown neurologist, in Base Instincts has proposed a 3-pronged theory of mental illness: physical brain damage and psychological trauma such as abuse, which produces people like Theo Durrant. Abusive experiences, mental illness, and neurological deficits interplayed to produce the tragedies reported in the newspapers, Pincus writes. His theory explains not only lust murders like Durrant's, but the seemingly random acts of violence that fill the pages of the local papers. The same complex of factors underlies the act of homicide, Pincus said. Attacks on strangers are substantially the same, ideologically, as attacks on friends. Regardless of the classification of killing, I believe most killers kill for the same reasons. Pincus based his theories on the research he conducted with Dr. Dorothy O. Lewis, who spent considerable time studying violent juveniles in search of a causal theory of crime. Lewis's theory is that violence is displaced rage against an abusive authority figure that is vented on an innocent victim. But what causes this rage? To Lewis, the rage is the final stop in a long process. First, physical abuse often causes central nervous system damage, thus contributing to impulsivity, attention disorders, and learning disabilities, she writes. Second, it provides a model with which to identify. Finally, it engenders rage toward the abusing parent, rage that can be then displaced onto authority figures and other individuals. A final theory of the origin of killers is the one proposed by criminologist Dr. Lonnie Athens. He takes a position similar to Samanow's in that violent criminals know what they are doing when they decide to act violently, according to his biographer, Richard Rhodes. Athens' discovery means that murders are never senseless from the murderer's point of view, that motives, however trivial and apparently unimportant they may seem to psychologists, do inform violent criminal acts, that violent criminals do not snap but make decisions and act on them. and that if a criminal will answer honestly, it is possible to know why the act was committed. Durrant's jury had no need of complex psychological theories. The doctors who examined the young man didn't offer much. The defense merely took the position that their client was not guilty by reason of the fact that he didn't kill the women. They made no attempt to justify the crimes by explaining that Durrant's repressive home life, combined with his paranoid personality, filled him with rage. Instead, the lawyers pointed out that Durrant had plenty of reason to be in the church between the time that witnesses saw him enter with Blanche Lamont and when he left after his encounter with George King. Further, the argument with Minnie Williams was merely a lover's quarrel, and Minnie was a hysterical woman anyway. After all, she had been acting strangely between the time of Blanche's disappearance and her own murder. Witnesses came forward who said Minnie told them, "I know too much about the disappearance of Blanche. I fear she has met with foul play." But the defense's efforts were in vain. The jury had barely settled in for their deliberations before the members came back with the guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced Theo Durrant to hang. The appeals process slowed the wheels of justice somewhat. It was nearly 3 years before Theo Durrant faced the hangman. In the intervening time, his attorney spared no effort to save his life, bringing up the details of his sordid sex life, drunken debauches on the Barbary Coast, and twisted fetishes. Still, court after court found the man to be sane and reaffirmed the death penalty. Finally, after the Supreme Court upheld the verdict and sentence, Theo announced that he was ready to die like a Durrant. He took the opportunity to parry with reporters who filled reams of notebooks with his quotes. "It is not so awful to go to such a death," he said as the January 1898 execution date neared. "Such a death as mine may be the means of abolishing capital punishment in this state." On the morning of his hanging, he declined to confess his sins to his priest, "because I am not guilty." Then he climbed the gallows, his arms strapped to his sides, and proceeded to begin a lengthy oration professing his innocence, blaming his conviction on the newspapers. "I now go to receive the justice given to an innocent boy who has not stained his hands with the crimes that have been put upon him by the press of San Francisco," he said. But as he gathered his energy to continue his rant, the hangman slipped the hood over his head. From beneath the white bag, Durrant's muffled voice could still be heard. "I do not look upon people now as enemies," he continued, oblivious to the hemp noose which the hangman had slipped over the hood. "I forgive them as I expect to be forgiven for anything I have done." His voice paused briefly as the executioner slid the knot down the rope just behind his right ear. Then Theo Durrant continued, "I am innocent. I say now, this day before God, to whom I now go to meet my dues, I am innocent." With his last breath, Durrant asserted his blamelessness, but the words had barely left his lips when the hangman sprang the trap and Durrant dropped the 3 feet below the gallows. The short drop snapped his neck, and the body hung there for several minutes, gently swaying like a pendulum, before 2 convicts were brought in to lower it down. The hood still covering Durrant's face, the doctor pronounced him dead, and the body was placed in the black lacquer coffin. Theo Durrant's handsome features were marred by the hanging. His blue eyes, which some people claimed were pale to the point of glassiness, bulged from his face, and his blackened tongue protruded from between his lips. It was thus that his parents received him in that small white room off the San Quentin execution chamber, and he remained that way as they enjoyed their afternoon meal. As the prison officials withdrew from the side room to give the grieving parents time with their dead child, Mrs. Durrant was heard to say, "Please, Papa, give me a little more of the roast." The story of Theo Durrant did not end there, however. His crimes were so heinous and the public so outraged that no cemetery in San Francisco would accept his bones. His parents finally had Theo cremated and buried his ashes in Los Angeles. Whatever motivated Theo Durrant to kill 2 women in the space of 9 days was never explained. His parents' behavior after his death was suggestive of a coldness and distance that may have pervaded the Durrant house. Undoubtedly, Theo Durrant would have continued to kill had his first 2 victims not been discovered so soon. His crimes have all the earmarks of the standard lust murderer who is driven to kill over and over until he is finally brought to justice. The great lengths he went to ensure his victims' sufferings, the lack of care he demonstrated once he was finished, and the denial or lack of remorse could only mean that Theo Durrant would not have stopped with just 2 victims. Like Bundy, Durrant was charming and handsome and, on cursory examination, the last person anyone would expect to be pegged as a homicidal maniac. But unlike Bundy, Durrant was not able to move outside his social circle to find his victims. Bundy was able to charm strangers into trusting him, knowing that if he killed too close to his home, he could be caught. This brings up an interesting aside. Since Durrant's killings were clearly sexual in nature, what if he had lived in a more permissive society? Say, for example, late 20th century, rather than 19th century San Francisco. Was it the fact that there were no Victorian singles bars the thing that kept his body count down? Thankfully, these questions need not be answered, and so ends the story of Theo Durrant, the young man who deceived everyone with his polite demeanor, yet hid a bloodthirsty monster within. Despite his relentless attempts to deny his crimes, there was no doubt about his brutality, and he ultimately met his fate at the gallows, his name forever etched in the history of ruthless killers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Durrant was merely a victim of circumstance, or was he a born criminal? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to support the channel by subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you never miss a new dive into the world of horror and mystery. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next episode, where the darkness hides even more terrifying secrets.